It's always so great to come to do this every single year and to see old and new faces. So thank you again for this great opportunity, as always, to interact with patients and my good mates in ITP Australia. Now, I've been told not to swear and also to keep the time. Unfortunately, is this because it's being recorded? Is that what it is? Damn it. You could just beat me out, though. Anyway, so I've got a great topic, talking about, I guess, something that I'm sure you've all encountered in the audience as patients, and that's really sort of trying to understand when the doctors are telling you about side effects, and also the sort of interpretation risk of these so-called side effects. And I guess in the next sort of 20 plus minutes, I'm hoping I could go through how should we decode what does this all mean from the patient perspective. So the first question is, why? And, what are treatment side effects? Why with all these treatments comes with small terms and conditions? Well, probably due to four kind of mechanisms, I guess, of drugs is the reason why side effects exist. So firstly, let's talk about the lock and key, I guess, effect, what we call off-target effects of medications. So I'm going to use this analogy that if you imagine the body, essentially a house, and a very complicated house, with many, many, many locks and doors. And really our treatments, well, what we want it to be, ideally, is the one key that unlocks that specific door that will stop our players being destroyed in ITP. Now, of course, the problem is, though, some of these keys can open other doors as well. So, for example, steroids, in a way, they're terrible master keys, more like a sledgehammer to a door. That they're going to, unfortunately, yes, they're meant to reduce the sort of immune attack on your platelets, but they're going to go knocking down and opening other doors that control mood, sleep, they control blood sugars. And I guess that sort of off-target effect, it's opening other doors, is really what side effects are. The collateral damage that we don't really want, because yes, we wanted to stop the attack on platelets, but it's unlocked all these other different doors, and that's side effects in a nutshell. Now, there is also a potential side effect of overachieving. Now, for those who don't know who this ridiculously genetically blessed lady is, Eileen Gu, who's, the most decorated, I think, skier in the world now. She's also studies quantum mechanics at Stanford, and she's also a bloody model, of course. I mean, we all, with being a triple threat like that. Now, she's absolutely an overachiever. And that could happen with our therapies as well, though, where our treatments, in fact, do too good a job. For one example of this is, our thrombopoietin receptor agonist, which some of you might have been have some experience with. So these drugs, we know, in a way, act like a megaphone. It's sort of shouting in our bone marrow factory, hey, giddy up, make more platelets for us. So it kind of stimulates the grandfather cells, what we call the megakaryocytes, to basically give birth to more platelets. And of course, that's great in raising the platelet count. But unfortunately, we know that as your bone marrow factory is literally being whipped into making more of these platelets, you're going to have some side effects of sometimes aches and pains in the bones of your muscles. And I guess, very uncommonly, it can go to the point where that constant activity from the bone marrow factory can actually cause what we call a little bit of fibrosis or scarring of the bone marrow, which thankfully is completely reversible if we reduce the dose or stop the drugs. So that's sort of an overachieving effect of our medications causing a particular side effect. What else could it be? Well, there's sort of the demolition effect, right? So one of drugs that some of you might have been exposed to, and this is probably for all, probably encompasses the whole class of our immune modulating drugs, but one of the ones we used for many, many years is a drug called rituximab. And what it is a very specific antibody. I know it's probably too soon for analogies, but it is like a guided missile. Let's not think about the Middle East. So it's like a guided missile that's really designed to go and find and seek what we call these B cells within our body that have been essentially the role was meant to differentiate friend from foe. And obviously in ITP, it's forgotten that. It's somehow thinking our platelets are the foe, are foreign to our body. So what this medication does, hopefully, it kind of clears out the body of these essentially B cells so that you'll stop. It kills the scout that's sort of falsely recognizing the platelets as being foreign. Now, demolition effect, though, is that it works pretty damn well. As soon as it attaches to the B cells, it gets the other immune cells actually to kill them. And that process, that very, very effective cell kill, releases all these sort of debris into the blood and induces kind of this almost hormone, or what we call a cytokine reaction to that very first infusion. And that's what we call an infusion reaction. Now, as I said, it's not unique to rituximab. It's actually quite universal, we think, for any of what is now very highly effective immune therapies. And I know some of you might have been exposed to clinical trials, some of these new agents. It is universal, I think, that anything that's going to be that effective in sort of interacting with your immune cells, you might have this sort of demolition effect, essentially, of being so effective, it causes this hormone reaction. Now, another issue, of course, then, well, what happens when a drug has done its job? Your liver and kidneys, in a way, got to break down the drugs. So that sort of then clogs out, or clogs up, potentially, some of the key organs that we know process trash, essentially, in our system. So we know the liver does this, and of course the kidney as well, in sort of processing and filtering out the cat. And that's the way to think about it. I think the liver processes our trash, and then I guess the kidneys are the sort of the rubbish chute where you literally pee it out of the system, right? So if you imagine that, whenever the body's handling drugs, and it's just not unique to ITP treatments, as any drugs, it's going to put a bit of a burden potentially on these two very important organs. And that's why you will see sometimes that we're monitoring for abnormal liver function. And very, very rarely, I think in ITP world, we don't worry too much about kidney issues, but the liver function is certainly something we keep an eye on, particularly when you're on drugs like azathioprine or the TPO receptor agonists. But most importantly, of course, is that, well, it doesn't happen to everybody, this sort of issue of impact on your kidneys or liver. We know that your unique genetics, the age of the patient receiving these drugs, and also your potential diet, for me, excess alcohol, can absolutely obviously contribute to abnormal function, right? So I guess, yes, these drugs, when you look at it, there might be a potential, but really there's all these other external factors that doesn't mean you're destined to definitely have a side effect from that particular medication. So switching gears a little bit more, for this, I've got to thank AI for making beautiful, beautiful images that I have to pay money for. So we know living is a very risky business, right? And that's the thing, there's no such thing as zero risk in our lives, and certainly not when we're taking medications when it comes to side effects. And of course, what we're hoping for, and not just in ITP, but in all doctors, we're hoping the benefits of the drug far, far, far outweighs the potential risk of side effects. And we know that there's no perfect drug where there's zero risk, right? And I guess, we're going to think about, this is probably what we live with every single day. So if you're out riding a bike, who could guesstimate the risk of you being hit by a car when you're riding a bike? Does anyone have a crack at it? Does everyone know? Depending on variables? Yeah, good point. I know, riding around in Canberra versus the streets of Sydney, I could tell you it's probably very bloody different. Yeah, you almost certainly be killed in Sydney. Sorry. 0.003% is the daily risk of. So really, living life, obviously, you just sort of, I want to, I guess, highlight, living life is a risky business. So, well, let's talk about, when we look at, and I'm sure you've all had this experience before, when you open your medications, there's that bloody information, leaflet, and then you open it as this huge list of side effects. And, I think I read one I'm taking pantoprazole for, again, alcohol-induced reflux. And it's a long list. And I'm like, oh, geez, and I've just chucked it in the bin. But where did this list come from, though, right? You think every drug has this massive list, right? Look, and that's the thing, it comes from very, very highly regulated clinical trials where essentially during the trial, and those of you in the room who generally are involved in clinical trials, as researchers, we have to document every single symptom the patient basically tells us during the course of the trial for the whole follow-up phase, regardless whether the drug actually caused it, right? So I have a patient in the trial, and I said, oh gosh, I've had a massive bender, and I fell over. 4, clearly secondary to the drug. I've got to write that down. Well, actually, no, I would say it's not due to the drug. But literally every single symptom a patient complains of during the course of the treatment and the follow-up, we have to document that that is our researchers' duty and role. Those symptoms get onto that long list, right? So your hair falls out. I feel like I'm losing a bit of hair. They have to write that potential side effect. That might be due to the fact that I'm stressed as hell at work because of my crazy colleagues. But you still that goes onto that list, right? So everything the patient is complaining of, whether or not related to drug, it makes it onto that list. So that's really important. You've got to think about that. That might not be due to the drug, essentially. And very importantly, I mean, those side effects, it's raw population data. It is not a prophecy that you will lose your hair or you will have a normal liver function. So I think that's really, really important that, it is not a prophecy that you're destined to have that particular side effect. And I think that's really, really important. Now, I think we often use, I guess, our experiences from clinical trials and therefore the data that we get from that when we talk about then the risk of side effects. So for example, from the clinical trial, and remember that's a population of patients only. And look, it could be anything from 40 patients to 4,000, but we're going to get our, I guess, risk of the side effects really from that particular population. So even though we say, yes, that trial showed 1 in 9 patients develop that side effect, it doesn't mean you're going to be that person, right? And again, your unique biology, your lifestyle, and really, of course, other comorbidities is what really going to really dictate, I guess, in a way, whether one's going to experience a side effect or not. Here's what we're going to talk about a little bit about the medical jargon we use. I'm not sure whether I had experience of this, where you've been speaking with various medical practitioners and they're talking to you about risk in these sort of terms of how common or uncommon or rare it is. Now, this is really quite interesting. In the European Union, it's actually legislated that essentially all risk of side effects, you have to use a verbal descriptor. So common, uncommon, and rare. They have very, very clear defined definitions, actually, in the EU. And certainly this has been adopted, I must say, in most now, I guess, side effects where they're listing them as is a common, what are the common and rare side effects. But here's the thing, though, right? When I think of what common is, it might be different from what someone else's definition of common is, right? So what does it actually mean? So there was a beautiful study that was published where they looked at exactly that, comparing what people's interpretation of risk based on verbal descriptors. So what was a common side effect, and that's defined as 1 to 10%, in patients, that's interpreted on average as a 34%, or is the rate or the incidence of what is considered to be a common side effect. So you can see the discrepancy, right? It is 3 to 30 times higher than what the actual reality is in terms of the incidence. And it's not just, when we look at then what is considered a rare side effect, the reality is 0.1 or 0.001% patients are interpreting rare as something as high as 18%. That's 1 in 5, right? So what, I guess, in the medical literature is telling you 0.01%. When we're talking about it using the word rare, as a patient, you're thinking, oh, that's 1 in 5. I have a 1 in 5 chance of getting that rare side effect. So I think this is, something that we've got to keep in mind, that words carry power. And sometimes you might have to just go ask the clinician, I'm sorry, when you say rare, are you able to provide me with actually the number? Because I might be, obviously interpreting in a different way. So I think this is a beautiful study telling us how sometimes the words don't match with the actual, I guess, statistical incidence. Now, another way, I guess, for us to visualize risk is, well, how can we compare with something else? And I guess this is where another technique would use is comparing what we call the community risk scale. And I guess we try and then because, not being a statistician, what does 1 in 10,000 mean? What does it actually mean? It's very hard to visualize. And I think one way is thinking about, okay, let's picture our neighborhood, town, street, and whatnot. And then let's put risk based on that visualization. For example, what is considered to be very common, 1 in 10, expect this is something that would happen within your household, okay? So that's what I might envision. Okay, very common, something that will happen within my household, which is crap, pretty common. But then when you think about, okay, common 1 in 100, well, this is something that might happen to someone living in your street, right? And then uncommon is something that happened in one's village, although we don't live in villages now, unless we're obviously in a smaller town. But then going ahead, small town, rare would be something that happens in the town you're living in, so 1 in 10,000. And very rare, we're talking about one person in a large town, and extremely rare would be one in a major city like Melbourne, right? So that might be one way for us to think about risk then when the doctor is telling you, okay, it is 1%, it is 0.1%, is you could think of, okay, so that would be in a large town, 1% of everyone with ITP taking a medication may get that side effect, right? So a way to help us to visualize that risk in a meaningful manner. Another way that we could think of course, is trying, visualize risk in terms of distance. So in this particular way, if you think about, well, imagine 1 in 100 then would be like us trying to find a 1 meter stick in a line of sticks that's across 100 meters. That's 1 in 100. Now we're talking about 1 in a million then, that's trying to find a 1 meter stick for us driving from Sydney to Perth. Pretty bloody rare, right? But that's I think a much better way of then visualizing that, okay, that is probably unlikely I'm going to find that stick. So another way to visualizing, I think, when we're getting numbers chucked at you. Now, sometimes, and the media loves doing this, talking about relative risk, right? It's a great marketing, I think, strategy. Because, for example, in 1995, there was this massive, well, not massive, but it was a publication, I think, that came out talking about the risk of DVTs with the contraceptive pill. And the headlines from media back then was, certain pills doubled your risk of a blood clot, right? And that sounds really, and I could remember the COVID, remember COVID in a vaccine situation? Yeah, I think we'll remember the fear, I think, from the media about the risk of that very rare, what we call VIT, complication from the AstraZeneca vaccine. So this is really, to me, brings traumatic memories. I'm sure Phil and Liz will remember those times. So when you hear about your risk is doubled being on this particular treatment, you're obviously going to think that's not good at all. That sounds scary as hell. But you got to remember, okay, if you double a tiny dot, it just gives you 2 tiny dots. Because when you look at what the actual maths means, that, yeah, look, the absolute risk of a woman on getting contraceptive pill, developing a DVT is 1 in 6,000. Doubling the risk is 2 in 6,000. It's still pretty damn rare. So again, this is where when someone's giving you a relative risk, saying, oh, look, you're 4 times more likely to X, you've got to ask the doctors, well, what's the actual absolute risk we're talking about here, right? So, and I guess, unfortunately, that's sometimes just because doctors don't really think about it, they just sort of go there and have their usual spiel. But obviously, you got to remember that that's words mean, I guess, confer power. That sometimes it can be quite scary when you hear about that. Ask them to give you the absolute risk. So, now, I think everyone would obviously process information very differently, and then really there's 2 probably different types of I guess personalities. I'm definitely the she'll be right group. I just chucked that thing in the bin, right? I didn't care how much. So, but look, everyone's obviously quite different in their approach, and and it's absolutely all valid. I mean, if you want to know every single detail, yeah, look, please don't feel shy. I think you're the one taking the medication. By all means, please ask all the questions that you want from from your clinician. And yes, definitely, I've seen patients where they're literally assigned on clinical trials where, trust her, mate, she'll be right. I'm like, okay, you've been to read all that. Yeah, no, I'm fine. So anyway, I think what's very important is open communication. It's really letting your clinician know how much information you want and the way that's, I guess, relayed to you. So really, I think, and I know last year we talked about shared decision making, and really this is really an integral part of that became an active participant in your healthcare. Think about asking these 3 questions, I guess, whenever you are talking about different therapies. What are your options? What are obviously the pros and cons, and of course the risks? and how can you get support potentially to make a decision. And I know Danny has worked very hard on these amazing shared decision making toolkit cards, which are awesome. So maybe there's something you could bring in to the consultation. And just finishing up, really, you're a partner in your own care, so communication is absolutely a two-way street. And really, I think, always speak up if you're not understanding what the medical jargon is. And now I know that's easy to say, that you might not have a clinician that you feel comfortable doing that. And I have to say, I know it's terrible, but maybe you need to find a different dance partner that if they're not really just vibing with you. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, what you have is you have a chronic disease, and I think you probably want someone who's a long-term partner with you, right? So I think don't feel shy. There's nothing wrong with seeking a new dance partner that's going to walk this journey with you. And look, ask for different, formats, So if someone's explaining something to you in a way that you don't understand, can you explain it in a different way? And take your time. I think that's really important, that whenever you are faced with a choice with different therapies, you don't need to rush into anything. You take your time to digest, to absorb, and ask as many questions as you need, from other people before you make your decision. And I think, remember those long list of side effects. It's just data, right? You're in charge. You get to absorb, you get to consider. Ultimately, you get to make the choice. And I think that's the end of my talk. And I don't know why I left a blank page, but that's it. Thank you.